I here present an exercise and some remarks on two of the exam questions in the 2009 re-exam question set. First, an exercise inspired by current events. So again, as before, as in the study cafe, I suggest that you'll read the information here. There is some information on what happened in two different regions in Italy. And down here on the x-axis we have time, and on the y-axis we have number of corona cases, and the graph indicates what happens in these two different cities. So I suggest you spend a couple of minutes thinking about randomized control trial, quasi-experiment, something else, what's going on here. So after you've had the opportunity to think about this for a little while, having paused it, I here present some thoughts on it. So what do we see? We see that two different cities, areas in Italy, made different decisions in terms of how to handle the coronavirus. Lodi engaged in social distancing, Bergamo did not. And we see a clear difference in terms of how the number of cases has developed over time. Is it a randomized control trial? Well, the data does show a clear difference between the cities. It's argued, or the way it's portrayed is that there's sort of one variable that is different. We don't know if these two cities took other choices. We don't know if they did anything else. Maybe it's not only social distancing. So yes, the cities are different, but maybe also the people in the cities are different. Maybe Bergamo just has more old people. Maybe Lodi doesn't have, maybe it just has far less. There could be different reasons in play. So we can't really call it a quasi-experiment because cities have self-selected into these different treatments. But it's still a data set that strongly indicates that there could be something going on about this social distancing, the value of that. So it's certainly a longitudinal data set that shapes development over time, and it's potentially shaped by this one key difference. But calling it a randomized control trial or quasi-experiment, we can't really, because we don't know how many other things have been in play here. Okay, next up is then question 1 from the 2009 re-exam. And again, I will suggest that you spend some time on trying to read this case, read the questions as they're outlined up here. There are two different studies, and try to think about how you would answer these questions. And in a minute, I'll provide some thoughts on this. So when you've had an opportunity to pause it, think about it, we can move on here to the next slide, where for one, I've just highlighted some key elements to pay attention to. I have some more remarks on the next page, but just want to highlight a couple of the key things. So here in study 1, it's made clear that the participant decides when to show up based on their own assessment of their sleep. And some students show up having slept well the first time, others slept poorly the first time they showed up. So there is not a randomized allocation of who sleeps a lot and who doesn't sleep a lot. There is self-selection into when you show up. So the sleep number of hours you've slept hasn't been manipulated. And so one thing to worry about is, well, what might be the reason for why students sleep poorly? Maybe they are stressed and worried and have stuff to think about, which might cause them to sleep poorly, which might then again cause them to perform poorly on whatever tasks they were supposed to carry out. So we don't know if it's an effect of the sleep because we haven't manipulated it as we would like to do in a randomized control trial. So again, there is this self-selection into the two different treatments, or whatever we should sort of call them. So there's a focus on average variation. There's focus on comparing across two different kinds of groups. There is no sort of longitudinal data as such. We're not comparing before and after. We're just comparing two different sets of students who've slept either a lot or a little. We don't. It's not a measurement of what happened before something and after something. So it's a cross-sectional design, and that's sort of the overall assessment of whether we want to call it an RTC. We can make some further remarks on the internal validity. I've already mentioned this, that we don't know why they slept poorly. It might not be an effect of sleep. It might be an effect of something else. But there's also something about the measurement of sleep where we can see, in contrast to study 2, that the measurement of how well people have slept is not as strong. Do we always know if you slept poorly or well? I guess we have an intuition. Some might have smartwatches that captures it, and we haven't sort of taken this into account. Maybe some of the people have a really good measurement, and maybe others won't. So, on top of not really quite being an RTC, on top of there might be an element of people sleeping poorly because of something else, meaning that there's something else, potentially the stress or the worry or whatever it is, that is actually causing variation. On top of that, we also have a poor measurement of the construct of sleep that we're interested in. Again, on the next slide, you'll see more. I'll just move on here just to sort of let you know there is something more coming here about some of the remarks I'm making here. In terms of external validity, it's sort of unusual compared to the examples we've seen so far, that they've actually done this study in 4 different labs around, well, not around the world, but at least in Europe and North America. So that's a stronger ability to generalize from the samples they've relied on to a broader context. It's not just sort of one particular narrow geographical area. But there's still this interaction of setting and treatment. So it's a particular kind of task, and dealing with conflicts in the lab is certainly quite different than dealing with conflicts in a workplace, in an actual organization. So there is this interaction of setting and treatment, and there is also interaction of selection and treatment. I mean, the kind of people that are selected into this, in part because of the areas they come from, but also who actually does take part in studies at universities. They might also be particular. So we have a couple of reasons for why the external validity should be sort of limited. And since it was happening in a lab, then as usual, there's also weak ecological validity. We don't have a lot of information about the task they had to do, so it's actually difficult for us to say a lot. Okay, so study 2. Here we have an allocation of half the participant into one group, and they sleep less and the others sleep more. We don't have explicit information about a random allocation, but I guess we could assume that, just point it out, but at least there is a clear treatment. Certainly stronger internal validity than in study 1. I guess one could say, why were they woken up during the night? Why couldn't they just sleep less and be woken up after 6.5 hours? So there are different ways of implementing the treatment, sleeping less. There's actually variance, just like Nelson would say. There are different ways of measuring if one has slept less. Do you wake them up every 3 hours? Do you just make them sleep less in the end? Just another example of this heterogeneity. And external validity, we have the same threads as above, and we only have one lab, so we don't have that variance across the lab. And sleeping in a lab is certainly also very unusual. There might be some kind of Hawthorne effect that's also in play here. But yeah, overall, certainly stronger internal validity because you've had this allocation of people into different treatments. As mentioned, we have an overview of some of the comments I've made here that you can also peruse and get a handle of what are the key elements to pay attention to. Okay, another question, so please read this, think about how you would answer this, and I'll provide some remarks afterwards, which are also highlighted in the next slide. Okay, so we have this quote from the physicist Heisenberg, and as you will hopefully have noticed, this is a quote that was also shown in class, not just this year, but it was actually also shown in class last year, so it wasn't a surprise for them to see it. And then these are just some of the remarks that you could offer here. Please rely on the curriculum to expand upon and explain what the statement means. And we could, for instance, say there is something about this. We don't observe nature itself, but nature exposed. So apparently there is something that can be exposed. There is something out there to be revealed. It's not, we don't reveal nature by itself, but we construct, or whatever sort of way you could finish the sentence. There is something to be exposed. So it sounds very much like post-positivism. As Gruber says, although a real world driven by real natural causes exists, it's impossible for humans truly to perceive it with their imperfect sensory and elective mechanisms. It does sound very much like the quote, right? So epistemologically speaking, as Gruber says, it's some sort of modified objectivity, we cannot obtain truth, objectivity in some kind of absolute sense. And in an answer, one would then expect you to expand upon this post-positivist position and why it's not the other positions. Why isn't that positivism or constructivism fits? But this is sort of the key elements to get to, and sort of the key perspective from in terms of the isms to invoke. We could also rely on Kuhn and say, well, this phrase, a method of questioning. Kuhn has talked about how we have certain paradigmatic ways of trying to understand the world within different paradigms. We have beliefs, values, techniques, etc. We have these 4 different elements of a paradigm, and so we don't observe nature as it is in itself because we have paradigmatic glasses on, so to speak. We have some expectations and education and experience that shapes whatever we see out there and interpret. So one wants to expand this a bit more, and a good answer we would talk a little bit more about what a paradigm is and how, and for instance, the Kuhn quote about how we literally don't see the world as it is in itself, but what interpretation always ends where we're seeing. Interpretation begins when seeing ends, so you could also emphasize that quote. Finally, we could also draw upon Nelson and how he says there are some heterogeneous variables that have fuzzy boundaries. We don't have direct access to nature as it is. We have different ways of trying to measure it, whether it's nature understood as unemployment or motivation or research and development or firm performance or sleep or whatever it is. So the number and the assumptions behind its construction, for instance, the number of how we measure performance or whatever it is, comes to be treated as what the phenomenon is rather than as a useful if limited measurement of that phenomenon. So it's sort of the similar point of view about this, exposed to that we don't get the essence of how the world actually is in itself. Even though that's what we think, we treat it as if we see the world as it is in itself. But as he says, it's a limited measure. There is there's a constructed measure that we are seeing here.